Hello, I'm Sarah Barth, Executive Director at Semper Virens Fund. Thank you for joining us in another of our Under the Redwoods webinar series in which we talk about all things Redwood and explore their beauty, their history, the science behind them, and the benefits that they provide to us and many other creatures. Semper Virens Fund acknowledges that the redwood forests in the Santa Cruz Mountains, within which we do our conservation work, are among the ancestral homes and lands for many indigenous peoples, people who cared for these lands for millennia until they were forcibly removed. And we are grateful to now work with their descendants, including the Amamutsin tribal band and the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, to support them in the restoration of their cultural and traditional relationships with these amazing forests. I also, before we get going, want to thank Scharf Investments. They have been the sponsors of this webinar series, and we really appreciate their support. And just some housekeeping measures. This webinar is being recorded and will be rebroadcast on our website. During the course of the webinar, you can ask questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. And a special note, today we have joining us an American Sign Language interpreter, which is fantastic and part of our efforts to make our work more accessible to broader audiences. And in addition, we have closed captioning being offered, as we did at our last webinar. And if you want to avail yourself of that, click the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. So thank you to the folks who are helping us with those closed captioning and sign language interpretation efforts. A few updates from Semper Virens Fund before we bring our speaker on. This is the end of our fiscal year. I know it isn't that case for most of the rest of you. But it's a time of reflection for our organization because of that. And we have had a year of pretty extreme weather, atmospheric rivers, ever looming risk of wildfire, a lot going on in this region. There always is, but especially this winter. And despite that, I was so pleased to be able to report to our board and now to all of you that we are making incredible headway in our efforts to conserve ever more of the redwoods in our region and accompanying watersheds. And we are part of a significant coalition of land managers that are getting ever more sophisticated and creative and proactive in the way we help tend and manage these forests to try to protect our communities, both the natural communities and our human communities, from the impacts of these more extreme weather events. We are on the cusp of announcing a bunch of new conservation successes in terms of additional land acquisitions that we're doing to support conservation in this region. So stay tuned for news of that. And we are just waiting for state parks to get started in the next phase of public involvement and planning for the reopening of Big Basin, and we are gearing up to engage in that process, and will be a resource for all of you to learn how you can engage and participate in that effort. And then maybe most importantly, I want to thank all of you for taking action. We asked you this year to really weigh in the state budget process and to be a voice for state funding for climate resilience, wildfire risk reduction, forest management for climate resilience. And you all weighed in. We don't always ask you to do that, but increasingly it's become important that you all raise your voice in supporting us and us supporting others to persuade our legislators to invest in these efforts. And although it's been a tight budget year for the state of California, the state was facing a large deficit. I'm really pleased to report that we just learned that a deal was reached last night, and it sounds like these sorts of investments are holding strong and are going to remain priority investments for the legislature and the governor. So that is a cause of optimism for continued support and investment in the conservation work that we all care about. So thank you to those of you who engaged. Your voices really do matter. And I wasn't certain we'd make it through this year with strong, solid conservation funding. And the latest news is that we are in a great position. So thank you for lifting your voices on behalf of nature. So there's a lot that I'm proud of, that Semper Virens is proud of, that you all should be proud of, because you are the community that makes this happen. One area where I think Semper Virens has growing awareness and intent, but has not really reached peak expertise or effectiveness, is in this question of accessibility to nature. Semper Virens has always had, from its very founding over 100 years ago, a dual mission of promoting conservation of these redwood forests and also promoting accessibility of these redwood forests. And I think we once thought that just turning these lands into state parks or other kinds of public lands would ensure that everybody could access them. But we are increasingly aware that that is not the case, and that many people do not feel welcome or included in our state parks, in other public lands. And so we are joining the conversation to learn more, learn how we can be more impactful in supporting those efforts. And fortunately today, I think we have the exact right person to speak with us, not only us, but our audience about this. So welcome, Syren Nagakyrie. Syren is she's a multifaceted person, writer, organizer, lover of nature. And through their work, the founder and director of Disabled Hikers. And through that organization, they are helping to build disability community and justice in the outdoors, and really work towards a vision of an outdoor culture transformed by representation, access, and justice for disabled and all other marginalized people. So with that, welcome, Syren. We're really glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Again, I'm Syren Nagakyrie, they, them pronouns. For accessibility, I'll give a visual description of myself, and I'll also give a visual description of the slides that I'll be showing. I'm a white non-binary person with shoulder-length brown hair, and behind me is the Disabled Hiker logo that says Disability, Community, and Justice in the Outdoors, with 3 disabled folks in a natural space. And I have a short presentation to share with all of y'all, and then we will get into a conversation. So again, I'm the founder of Disabled Hikers. We are building disability, community, and justice in the outdoors. And on the slide here is a photo of a group of a diverse variety of disabled folks on one of our group hikes. So I have multiple disabilities and chronic illnesses myself. I'm also neurodivergent and have always been disabled and chronically ill, and really grew up feeling very excluded from, not only the outdoors, but from society in general. And I didn't have the opportunities to engage in outdoor recreation that a lot of my peers did. So I spent a lot of times as a youth just honestly hanging out in my yard and watching the birds and the bugs, and just having this experience of place that was really different from a lot of other people that I knew. We didn't go on camping trips or, go out hiking or things like that. It was really well into my 20s before I realized that hiking was a thing that people did. And, I wanted to really figure out what that meant for me and my body and how I could have more of these experiences. So as I started figuring that out for myself and trying to find information and resources, I just came upon barrier after barrier and a lack of information, a real lack of understanding about disability in the outdoors and what my needs were, how to provide the information that I needed, and was just getting increasingly frustrated. But at the same time, when I went outdoors and really started to notice the diversity of ways that bodies exist in nature, that there's no one right way for a body to exist, and that it really takes a diversity of bodies, a diversity of ways of movement and sensory experiences to really make up a landscape, and all of that is incredibly valuable. So that really helped me feel much more supported in the outdoors and feel like I had a place to belong, because I could, recognize these diversity of experiences that were happening all around me. So here on the slide, I have a quote that says, "When I'm outside, I experience disability in the landscape. There are a diversity of ways for bodies and forms to exist in nature. There is no one right way for water to flow, and there is no one right way for my body to be either." And there's a photo of myself and my small dog Benji at an overlook. So I founded Disabled Hikers in March of 2018 after, as I mentioned, a lifetime of feeling excluded in the outdoors. It all kind of came to the head one day on an experience when I was out hiking in Olympic National Forest. And I had done tons of research ahead of time and thought I was going to start on this trail that would be accessible to me, and immediately encountered tons of barriers like steep stairs and rocky drop-offs and just all these really unsafe situations that really put me in a really dangerous situation and a very painful one. I was, had to keep going on this hike and was just getting increasingly in pain and frustrated and fatigued, and finally wound up at a bridge over a waterfall and was just standing there and feeling all this pain and frustration, and just inspiration struck in that moment. And I said, I'm going to do something about this. And I went home and wrote up the experience in a blog and created a little trail guide and called it Disabled Hikers. And we started from there and have really grown in the last 5 years into, we are a social media community. We have the website. We also do a lot of advocacy work, provide a lot of resources, write a lot of trail guides. I've written the Disabled Hikers Guide to Western Washington and Oregon that's published by Falcon Guides. I'm working on the Northern California guidebook now. We also do trainings, consultations with a variety of land managers and parks and organizations, and really anyone who will listen, to be honest. And we do a lot of trail assessments and site assessments for a variety of both outdoor and travel businesses and organizations. So again, our mission is to build disability community and justice in the outdoors with a vision of an outdoors culture transformed by access, representation, and justice for disabled and all other historically marginalized people. And on the left here is an artistic drawing of 3 disabled folks in a natural landscape. So who we are, again, is very much a community. We are very grounded in disability community. Here are 2 photos from our group hikes. These also happen to be in Redwood parks of, a variety of disabled folks outdoors. And for us, it's very important to be grounded in that community. My background is in grassroots organizing and activism, and that's very important for me. And we are entirely disabled led. Everyone who is involved in our organization is disabled or chronically ill in one way or another. And that is also very important because historically when disability in the outdoors is discussed or when organizations are founded, so many of them have not been led by disabled people. So it's really important for us that we really stay grounded in the community and have disabled leadership. So I want to give us a bit of a grounding in disability. I know that it can be an uncomfortable thing for a lot of people to talk about. So I want to give us, a little bit of that introduction. I'll talk about some language and some ideas and concepts about accessibility. But first, I always like to start with a question. And, this is just for you to kind of think to yourself about. And, who do you think about when you think about disability? Who comes to mind? What types of disability come to mind when you hear that word disability? For a lot of people, they immediately think of kind of the standard blue accessible wheelchair symbol, and that disability always means someone who uses a wheelchair. But there are so many types of disabilities. So here on the right, we have a graphic that features kind of stick figures of a variety of different types of disabilities. And it says some disabilities look like this and some look like this, which is just a standard human stick figure. And really, this is to represent the variety of types of disabilities. So I think that some people are really familiar with kind of the ADA definition of disability, which is any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. The ADA does cover all types of disability, so that's not limited to only mobility disabilities. It includes sensory disabilities, intellectual, psychiatric, neurological, developmental, physical, and more. There are so many types of disabilities out there, and not all of them are visible. Some disabilities are invisible, and those are called invisible disabilities, which means any disability that is not immediately apparent when you are interacting with someone or when you see someone. And this concept of invisible disability, I think, is helpful, but at the same time, it's also not true. Not disabilities aren't necessarily invisible. Once you get to know someone, or if you are very involved in disability community and know a lot of folks with disabilities, you come to recognize that not all disabilities look the same, and you come to to notice the variety of ways that disability manifests and the different types of needs that people have. So, I always caution people to not consider this term of invisible disability as another way to invisibilize folks, because, that is all too common, that all disabilities are entirely valid. At the same time, this ADA definition of disability is very grounded in what we call the medical model of disability. The models of disability are kind of these frameworks of ways that we think about disability. And, they're not always obvious. We may not know that, this is how we have been taught to think about disability, but they are kind of these social frameworks that have been developed to consider disability. So there are many models of disability, and there are honestly probably as many models as there are people who really study and think about this, but kind of the two primary ones that tend to influence society the most are the medical model and the social model. So the medical model of disability considers disability as a deficiency or an impairment that exists only in that individual person and only in their body. And because it is a deficiency or an impairment, it has to be cured or normalized for it to be, less of an impact on that person and by extension on society. The medical model really gives almost all of the agency to specialists and doctors and caregivers and really anyone except the disabled person. This model has really formed the foundation and the bedrock of how the medical system is formed, how the justice system is formed, how all of the social aspects that really influence disabled folks has been really based on this medical model. So in pushback to that, the social model became developed, which is this idea that disability is an entirely natural form of difference, that there's nothing abnormal, it's not an impairment, it's totally natural, and that the challenges that disabled folks face are due to social barriers. So that's things like, of course, the built environment, things like biases and stereotypes about disability, and that those are the things that need to be quote unquote fixed, not the disabled person themselves. And it really gives agency back to disabled folks rather than everyone else. So some ways that we talk about disability, there's lots of different ways of talking about disability and lots of frameworks for this, but you may be familiar with this idea of person-first language versus identity-first language. And there's lots of different ways to talk about this. And so there's person-first language, which is pretty common and well known. It really came into common usage through mostly governmental and nonprofit organizations, kind of as a way to push back against some of those stereotypes of the medical model. When you're up against this idea of like disability as an impairment and disabled people need to be fixed, then of course you need to emphasize the fact that no, disabled people are people first. So it really centers the person before the disability, but it also kind of separates the person from the disability. So some examples of this are saying person with a disability, woman living with blindness, boy with autism. So it puts the person before the disability and kind of separates them. This has been kind of the most common way of talking about disability for a long time. And as the disability movement has grown, there's been this shift toward identity first language, which centers disability as the core part of a person's identity and does not separate the person from the disability. This is really favored by many advocates, activists, and disabled folks. It really is a way to, again, to continue reclaiming disability as something that is natural and normal, as a core part of the way that we experience the world, as a core part of our identity and who we are, and really finding some pride in that. So I always tell folks that it's okay to use either one of these, and when you're speaking about disability in general, I always encourage folks to alternate between person first and identity first. But when it comes to individual people, to always respect the language that they choose to use. So I almost exclusively use identity first language, and that is very much what I prefer. But some folks do prefer person first language, and it's not okay to necessarily argue with them about that. Just respect that choice. But I do believe that above all, disability is inherently a political identity. Disability is very politicized, and it really influences the way that we interact with the world and the experiences that we have in society, and how society and these systems are really structured. So a few things that you should always avoid, things not to say, are euphemisms. These are words that are used in place of another word that is considered offensive. We use euphemisms throughout the English language, and they are almost always used to imply that the word that you are trying not to say is shameful or offensive. So when we use euphemisms to describe disability, some people think that they are being respectful, but really what you're saying is that disability is something that is shameful or offensive. So some examples of euphemisms include differently abled, handy-capable, diverse abilities, special needs. All of these words honestly they're doing whatever they can to not say the word disability, but disability is not a bad word. It's okay to say it. And, often when I hear people say things like, diverse abilities or differently abled, I think like, cool, like when am I gonna like join the X-Men? Like, where's my superpower? Like, I'm not abnormal, I'm not a mutant or a freak, I'm just disabled, and it's okay to say that. And there's also lots of outdated language that is still really commonly used, and they're very much considered offensive by large portions of the community now. So these are words like handicapped, wheelchair bound, suffers from X disability or chronic illness. These words were commonly used, again, kind of based in that medical model, but they are really no longer acceptable. And handicapped often comes up when talking about, accessibility. And, so I often tell people, instead of saying like the handicapped stall or handicapped parking, just say the accessible restroom or the accessible parking, or be much more specific, so it's wheelchair accessible. And also, like, wheelchairs are not things that people are bound to. They are, things, they provide freedom for people. So accessibility, what is it and how do we implement it? And here's a photo of one of my wooden canes against the tree. So the terms accessibility and access have really kind of, they are kind of entering more common language, and they are used in a whole variety of ways, oftentimes not to actually mean disability. So I really want to ground us back in, these are terms that describe, that are related to disability community and, disability needs. So accessibility is often refers to the characteristic that products, services, and facilities can be independently used by people with a variety of disabilities. This is really kind of, for example, embedded in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So on the left here, there's 4 symbols that represent different types of disabilities. So we have a wheelchair, a symbol that represents cognitive disabilities, symbols that represent ASL interpretation, and a symbol that represents blindness. And when people talk about accessibility, what often happens is that they are really tending to focus on compliance with legal requirements, because accessibility has been, to some extent, so embedded into the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that's how people think about it. So it's often just a checkbox. So they say, okay, we have the ramp into the building, check. We have the accessible restroom, check. But they don't think about the entire experience of disabled folks in the landscape. It also is really focused on individual rights. So the individual right of the person to access that space, rather than broader rights of the community. And it's often a reactive process. So people will, again, if they're kind of focused on from that compliance lens, they're reacting to a need to improve accessibility to meet their legal requirements. And being reactive towards accessibility, trying to bring accessibility in after the fact, after something has been created, is incredibly difficult and also incredibly expensive. So it's really important to think about that from the ground up. So when we talk about access as a framework or as a mindset, this really recognizes interdependence and the complexity of needs. It recognizes that accessibility is messy, and that people's needs vary a lot, and that one person's individual access needs may conflict with themselves. It may conflict with someone else. And how do we navigate that? There is no one size fits all to accessibility. It's really a process of figuring this out and how to create a space that is truly safe and welcoming to everyone. It's a much more proactive process, and it really addresses all of the barriers that people experience when they are engaging with the world and with a individual space. So it includes financial barriers, language, childcare, transportation, gender access, racial justice. All of it is really a part of considering access. And that also means reckoning with the history of disability exclusion and bias in our culture, and how that has been upheld for so long. So it's really focusing on the collective, on the community, and how to really address rights and how to provide care from a much more cohesive and holistic perspective. On the right here is a photo from the Disabled and Here project, which features a variety of disabled folks sitting out on a deck having conversation. And I always like to point out that even here we see that there's tables that are too tall for someone who's using a wheelchair. There are chairs that are too narrow for someone to comfortably sit in who is fat. So all of these other things that really come into the landscape and prevent access that may not necessarily be in that quote unquote checkbox. So that is it, and ready to go into conversation.
Thanks, Syren. That was really interesting. And one of the things I was most struck by is the comment that disability is part of natural variation, and anybody who studied conservation biology or ecology has seen that and is well aware of it. So it's surprising that it's not more well understood or well recognized, I guess, within our world. So Semper Virens has been thinking about these issues for a while, but in a much narrower way, I think, than you're defining it. And so we have a lot to learn. And one of the things that we get asked about a lot, I think that many in our conservation community assume that accessibility means paving, right? Paving trails, putting in alternatives to stairs, etc. And I imagine that the gut reaction to that is, well, that's somehow ruining nature. And I wonder, you spoke about this in the article that you wrote for us, which I really recommend to the audience that they read if they haven't already. But I wonder if you could speak a bit about that, about how you think about, you're obviously a lover of nature, as is everyone in this audience. How do you think about balancing accessibility needs with nature conservation? And is it any different than the conversation is for people who are not disabled?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we definitely need to start by recognizing the impact that we already have on nature, right? So just by having a trail there to begin with, we have already had an impact on that space.
Yeah.
So, acknowledging that and not trying to pretend that accessibility only impacts disabled people. It impacts everyone. Everyone has access needs in the outdoors. And then when it comes, specifically, wait for the interpreter to be pinned. So when it comes specifically to paving trails, I often say that there's lots of evidence that actually paving, for example, paving a popular trail and putting in an overlook and other features like that can actually reduce the impact on surrounding areas. So it can prevent people from going off trail or going down the hill to this overlook. When there is a very clear space for people to be, they will often choose to be in that space rather than going off on their own. And, there's lots of ways to mitigate the impact of asphalt in the natural environment. But again, it's about considering that overall impact and the fact that we already have an impact by being there. And yes, accessibility doesn't have to mean paving a trail, even just clearing the trail surface and making sure it's nice and firm can have a great impact for improving accessibility, and also addressing the different types of adaptive equipment that people use to access natural environments as a disabled person, and making sure that there is space for that is another way. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, and you've just started to touch on this, but in the context of, say, hiking trails, and you gave some examples of the built environment, which I think is maybe more intuitive, or people have had more experience, perhaps are more aware, maybe I should only speak for myself, of what some of that additional access looks like in a trail context, aside from the concept of, say, paving something. And actually, I think some of our staff would probably argue that paving might actually be, as you said, lower impact because it's reducing erosion and some of the other things that can happen when you're dealing with a non-paved trail. But anyway, what I was going to ask is, so what does that look like? If Semper Virens were to say, tomorrow we want to go and advocate for the Bureau of Land Management to manage the national monument in our region differently, what should we be voicing when it comes to trail design that would be different? How would you advocate for those things? What are the characteristics you would advocate for?
Yeah, so I will say that, of course, on the website, we have a couple of articles about this. There's one on trail surfaces, pro and cons, and the type of information to provide. So that gives some more detail there. But in general, you really want to make sure that there is, really firm, stable surface for folks to travel on, that it's wide enough for people to use wheelchairs and walkers and canes. So minimum 3 feet, but ideally, much wider for people who use adaptive equipment. And that there are places for people to rest, that if there's interpretive signage, that's provided in multiple formats, Braille, audio description, things like that. And that, what often happens is that accessible trails kind of become like the bone that we get tossed. So, often accessible trails like this really short, doesn't really go anywhere. Maybe you get one overlook and that's kind of it. So, but designing an accessible trail that is beautiful and a really meaningful experience is really important.
So really, I wonder, would you argue that most of the trails should, or all of the trails should be accessible trails, and it should be a non-issue, that the exception should be those that are not accessible?
Yeah, I mean, again, accessibility varies widely, and I'm not someone who, I don't believe that like every experience has to be accessible to every body, because again, bodies are different, needs and different abilities, skills are different. But I think if we approach designing and building trails from that accessibility mindset, rather than trying to tack on accessibility as a special thing at the end, I think that does benefit everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so speaking of which, I was so delighted to see that you are going to be engaging in the process at Big Basin State Park. And even though you are from outside the region, I know you're familiar with this area, and I think your wisdom is going to be really important to this process. And here we have, and I guess the only other time you have this is if you're creating an entirely new park from sort of just raw landscape. Here, because of the fires, the infrastructure and even the trail networks were largely destroyed. And so you are starting with a bit of a blank slate in terms of the recreational opportunities, the interpretive opportunities. And I know that State Parks has certainly said that they are really aspiring to be more inclusive. And I think that includes the disability community. But I wondered if you could share with us any initial thoughts you have about what you think some of the key issues may be as California State Parks moves forward in Big Basin, or maybe you haven't yet really had a chance to dive into it, but we will be following your engagement there with great interest. So any previews of what you might be thinking about it would be really exciting for this audience to hear.
Yeah, so we're just starting on that process, so I don't have much to share yet, but we will be working to create a more inclusive workbook to bring disabled folks into Big Basin and be able to provide feedback on what the park can be reimagined as and what is important and all of that. I think it is a really interesting opportunity, and of course, I mean, like everyone, I was heartbroken when the park burned, but you know, it is a really incredible opportunity to really kind of reimagine this and think from the ground up about what this can look like. So, yeah, I wish I had more to share, but I don't quite yet. So.
Yeah, but just for this audience, as I understand it from our earlier conversations, you're really going to engage in sort of a two-pronged way. One is to create a workbook that helps state parks better engage the disability community to get their input so that it's not just you giving them consultation, but really how can the agency be more effective at reaching this community and providing opportunities for input. And then second, you will also be providing your own direct advice and consultation around this. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, and we'll be bringing out a group of folks to Big Basin to do a site visit and you know, look at the landscape and talk about, you know, how disabled folks can and want to engage, and you know, and really reflect on the experience of Redwoods and how, you know, that resiliency and how, you know, how that also reflects on disability community. You know, disabled folks are incredibly resilient because we've had to be. So yeah.
I'm curious, not having been part of a lot of these discussions previously, I'm sure you've reflected on why it is that this is such, why isn't this already happening, right? Why is there resistance? Is there resistance, or is it just people aren't thinking about these things? And so as you anticipate engaging in the Big Basin process, what do you expect are going to be either the points of pushback, or maybe I'm asking the larger question, which is why do you think this has been such a barrier to begin with?
Yeah, that's a great question that I wish I knew the answer to.
Yeah, right. Just tell us the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, it is shocking to me, of course, that, you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act is over 30 years old, and the Architectural Barriers Act the Architectural Barriers Act is even older than that, which applies to federal recreational lands. And, you know, why are we just now getting to this point? Yeah, I'm not sure. And, you know, but I think it is interesting to be in this moment right now. And I think we are in an incredible moment of growth for social justice in general, and really reckoning with all of these issues. But, you know, again, I think disability for so long has been kind of the taboo subject, right? Like we don't talk about that. We're embarrassed of that. We're ashamed of that. And because agency has been removed from disabled folks for so long, that, you know, we've had to kind of claw back some of that so that we could have this space to start having these discussions.
Yeah. Well, and just as an outside of the disabled community observer, I see more awareness of it in the built environment, right? Because of the ADA and other requirements, you just see buildings being either designed from the get-go or retrofit. You see street curbs, and there's sort of obvious evidence to anybody who's paying attention. And yet I don't see it much in the sort of outdoor recreation space, not much at all. So it is going to be interesting to see how things play out in state parks here in California. And I sit on the State Park Commission, and so I get a chance to look beyond our region at state parks practices here in California. And I would say there has been outstanding awareness and discussion and activity in recent years around Indigenous rights and incorporating Indigenous knowledge, greater understanding of racial considerations, socioeconomic considerations in terms of who visits the park, greater awareness about telling different histories and stories about who's interacted with these landscapes over time. Not that it's all perfect, but I'm just saying I've seen great movement in this direction, and yet discussions around the disability community are not as prominent. It's not that it's never discussed, but it's not at the same level. And so I think there is a way still to go. So I'm really grateful to you for having created your organization. And I guess I'm curious, how can an organization like Semper Virens be an ally to your organization and to your community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I think, of course, things like this are a great opportunity, providing a platform for disabled folks to share their stories and their experiences, and then really engaging with the community to learn about the needs of folks, in the area where you live and how they interact with parks, and, learn about the variety of access needs that are out there, and then start advocating. And, if you, go to a park and once you learn about, different types of accessibility with trails, and you notice that a trail is not accessible, or a trail that was accessible and now needs maintenance, advocate for that and encourage the park to make those changes. Often accessible trails kind of get just left by the wayside. They get built and then that's kind of it. So advocating for that maintenance and those improvement projects.
Great. One last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience and their questions. You and I spoke about this right before when we were preparing for this webinar, that the state, California Natural Resources Agency, just released its Outdoors for All strategy or report, but it really outlines a strategy of actions to try to make the amazing resources here in this state, the amazing natural, cultural, historic resources, more accessible, and which I think is indicative of the momentum I mentioned that I've been seeing around broadening the inclusivity of our natural resources to the larger public. My review of the report did not, and I read it right after I spoke with you, and I did not see a lot in there that spoke to the disabled community. And I wondered sort of what your macro level reactions were to the report, and or whether you or others in your community are really working with our State Natural Resources Agency to sort of open their eyes to some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also did just a quick scan of the plan, and agree that there wasn't really much. A, there wasn't much specificity in there, and B, there weren't many mentions of disabled communities, or even many marginalized communities themselves. And that was a little. I wish I could say it was surprising, but it wasn't really. And I don't know the reasons for that, and I'm not involved in that process right now, but. I would hope that as Outdoors for All is implemented and these strategies start taking off, that there will be more opportunities for the community to really have an opportunity to share their experiences and their voice, and really help guide this process. Because again, especially with the disability community, there has been so much that has been done for us and not with us. So,
Yeah.
allowing us, those opportunities is really important.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. I'm going to invite my colleague Matt to share with us some of the questions that we've received or you've received while we were chatting. But in the meantime, while he's doing that, I will just say I feel like, and it's exciting to continue to have your eyes opened, even after having worked in this field for a very long time. I'm a little chagrined they weren't opened earlier, but they are now. So we will definitely be following your work with interest and paying a lot closer attention to the ways that we can support these efforts.
Thank you.
So, all right, Matt, do you have questions for Syren?
I do. Syren, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been really great. We had a couple questions I wanted to kind of combine here regarding maybe some best practices that you're seeing. So, someone noted that in museums, sometimes there's set aside periods for autistic visitors where there's a quieter environment and less visitors. And wondering if you are seeing any good examples of making the outdoors accessible to people with cognitive disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is definitely, in the kind of context of disability and accessibility in nature and how much it is lagging behind, that is definitely an area where it is especially lagging behind. I do know of the Autism Nature Trail in Letchworth State Park in New York State, which was designed with multiple sensory stations along a 1-mile trail that it provides a very safe space for families with autistic children and autistic adults to go and have an experience where they know that they'll be safe and accepted in that space. Other than that, I don't really know of too many places that are really engaging in that work and creating sensory friendly spaces and acceptance for autistic folks. So that is definitely a place that we have a lot of room to work on.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I'm going to broaden this to a bigger level for a moment. We just had somebody ask this question about centering the most marginalized among us in open spaces. Can you speak to how that is really beneficial to each and every person who visits nature?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely have a tendency to silo people into single identities, right? But so many of us have intersecting identities and hold multiple marginalized identities, and really centering those experiences is really gives us a window into kind of some of the, I hate to frame it as the worst, but really kind of some of the most crucial ways that people are excluded and kind of the most important needs that people have. Because when you meet the needs of the most marginalized folks, you are going to meet the needs of a lot of people. So it is incredibly important to do that, and to not try to silo people into individual identities.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. There's a question about what it's like to have conversations with land managers regarding the tools that are used to share information, whether they're for low vision or vision impaired, or perhaps how to communicate with hikers and park users who may be nonverbal. In what ways are you intersecting with land managers at sort of that functional level of interpretation, support for users, visitor services, signage, and those kinds of things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question. We definitely work with a lot of land managers in really just providing better information about the entire experience and for all access needs, and not limiting it to just one. So that includes training for interpretation staff, so that they know how to interact with a variety of disabilities, training for volunteers, training for friends groups that interact with the public, making sure that they all have that training so that they know how to interact with the community, and how to provide information in a variety of formats so that it is accessible to as many people as possible, and making it easy, easy to find. So, for example, not burying it 50 pages deep on your website, and just making sure it's like right there and available, making sure that there's things like trail access information signs at trailheads, which are thankfully pretty popular in California state parks, that provide kind of some of that basic statistic information about a trail right when you get up there. But again, that information isn't necessarily always provided in multiple formats. So really thinking about through that, and yeah.
Great, thank you. I would imagine it takes, there's a lot of baked in assumptions on how to do the work at a fundamental level, and then to be able to add that kind of sort of depth of communication, again, really benefits everybody. Can we switch
I
to,
think,
oh, please go ahead.
yeah, I think, that's has been one of the obstacles of, approaching this from that compliance mindset. And, when accessibility becomes just something on the checklist, then, it's, oh, okay, check, we did this and that and this. And they don't have the opportunity or the time or the understanding to really be able to think about it from that bigger picture, and, how to move beyond just the compliance. So.
Well, one of the things that maybe is also a check box that park agencies, check is a rating system, how to rate trails. Can you talk about the challenges with rating systems, and particularly how they impact the disability community?
Yeah. So I have created our own difficulty rating system called the Spoon rating system. You can find it on the website and in the books. But for so long, people will have described trails as easy, medium, hard, right? And really no context about what that means. So easy for who, difficult for who? It kind of comes from this basic understanding of like, there's one type of person that engages in the outdoors, but that has never been true, even when you're not thinking about disability. Even non-disabled people have a variety of needs and accessibility and skills and all of that. So it's really important to be very objective and clear when you're describing the quote unquote difficulty of a trail and what that means and who it's for. So for example, our trail rating system is on a 1 to 5 scale, but it's very clear about the different factors in that rating system. So, it combines things like length and trail surface and specific elevation gain and the specific grade or slope on the trail, and all of that factors into how to decide, the difficulty on the trail. But also acknowledging that even still, that is not going to be true for everyone. So for us, a 1 spoon trail may be a 3 spoon trail for someone else. So, I think inherently difficulty rating systems are problematic, but it is also, important to provide some kind of at least basic way for people to kind of find that information and start looking for it. So.
Try to create a more accessible system of interpreting how difficulty can be described at different trails settings. That's great.
Well, and more consistent, more standardized. It sounds like that's part of the issue as well.
Yeah, there's very little standardization among how people write about trails, how people describe difficulty of trails, what kind of information is available. You'll go to one park and they'll provide, a full trail description with like length and elevation and all of that. And then the next park will just say, oh, it's this trail this long, and that's it. So yeah, standardizing that information is really important.
That would be great. That would be a great achievement alone, much less all the other great things we're trying to accomplish. Some folks had some questions about how they can help. from, are there recommendations for folks who are new to outdoor recreating and maybe don't identify as disabled, but would benefit from greater accessibility in the outdoors, to folks who are asking for ideas on how they can get involved and take action on behalf of the disability community. And then finally, book and resource recommendations for those who want to learn more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, so in terms of, getting involved and advocating for the community, as I mentioned before, it's really important to start by doing your research. So, look up things like the Architectural Barriers Act, look at, our trail guides, our spoon rating system, the guides and resources that we have on our website, and start educating yourself about what accessibility in the outdoors means and looks like, and the variety of access needs that are out there. Follow a variety of disabled folks on social media, learn about their needs and what they experience. And then, when there's, things like funding opportunities for trails, to, put in your comments about, we need funding to improve accessibility in trails, and, talk with your local parks about about improving accessibility, and, just be that extra voice, because, it's really exhausting to advocate for yourself all the time. So, we need other people to, to advocate for us as well. And in terms of resources, I've named a few there. There's some on the website. I think I'm forgetting the other part of the question. But
no, that's great. That's what I think folks needed to hear. I just had one quick question, I think probably from me. I'm wondering if there's anything on the policy side, either, in the states or at the federal level, that we should be paying attention to and helping folks pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will say that we haven't done a lot of policy advocacy work. I used to do a lot of that, and I'm a little, we'll just say, burned out. So I'm not as familiar with the current policy work going on outside of the, the Outdoors for All and the various events or funding opportunities that are coming through.
Well, I know we will look forward to advocating on these issues, and in particular, we'll use your engagement at Big Basin as an opportunity to continue to learn about how these things translate into real live action and real live trail systems, recreation plans, interpretive plans. So I really look forward to continuing to be in dialogue with you about this and learning how we can continue to be supportive. I'm sure we will have you back. So I just want to thank you, Syren. You've been amazing. And I really hope that our audience has been stimulated to really think about some of these issues differently. So with that, I want to thank not only you for joining us and for your leadership in this area, but to our audience for joining us, and to let everyone know that next month we've got also a really exciting guest. Erin Sharkey is coming to talk about Black nature writing and her new anthology, which is called A Darker Wilderness. So I encourage folks to join us next month for that. Thank you again to Scharf Investments for their support. And I really encourage this audience to check out disabledhikers.com or .org. Syren's got an amazing amount of material and information on there where you can continue your learning if you're interested in this topic. And finally, I guess I want to thank our interpreters and our closed captioning folks for helping us make baby steps in the right direction to broadening our own materials and our own accessibility. So, all right, thank you all, and we'll look forward to seeing you all under the Redwoods next month.